Chapter 31. Take a break. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The tension in the air ceased a bit after both sides introduced themselves. Since she had made up her mind to follow Xavier to witness the demise of the orcs, they both chatted more freely as they journeyed, having gotten each other's names. "So, you said your family were really killed by orcs?" She nodded firmly. And with a faraway look in her eyes she added, "I was a child then. It was a really traumatizing event. The orcs stormed our small cabin and slaughtered my entire family." She trembled ever so lightly as she narrated, "My poor mother was raped bloody right before my father's eyes. It was the last thing he saw as he bled out from the wounds inflicted on him by the orcs." Xavier shuddered at her recollection. He asked her gently, "But how did you survive the attack as a child?" She used the back of her hand to wipe a single tear drop trickling down her face before answering him in a sorrowful tone, "As a child, I always loved the riverside. On that particular day, by some random act of fate, I had ignored my mother's warnings and went down to the riverside to play." She paused to catch her breath as she relived the painful memory yet again. "By the time I got back, I found my bits and pieces of the flesh of my father and older brothers scattered all over the bloodied house. My poor beautiful mother was bleeding profusely from both of her lady parts after being raped by multiple orcs." Xavier listened on. Her pain was evident. "My mother's jaw had been dislocated because the orcs had forced their large organs into her tiny mouth down her throat. She was barely breathing when I found her. Her belly was swollen with liters of semen the orcs had discharged in her. She was soaked in a pool of her own blood. Crying, I held her in my arms as she took her last breath." Xavier now had an inkling on the sort of past Adelia had lived. The short but brief history she had given him showed him that her hatred for orcs ran deep. He finally understood why she had been in shock when he found her. Adelia's family members had been brutally slaughtered by the orcs, so it must have been a real terror for her as the orcs prepared to have their way with her. Xavier knew that the nightmare must have had plagued her for years, so it was understandable why she hadn't moved an inch long after he had killed the first orc. Instead, she had chosen to remain in the midst of the carnage. Surrounded by the dead bodies of the soldiers who had been gored by the orcs, Xavier knew that she had been forced to witness again a horror that she had fought to repress. He couldn't help but commend her mental strength. "You really are a brave girl, Adelia. There aren't many people who could have endured what you have been through, and participate in hunting orcs." The beautiful blonde shook her head sadly and smiled a bitter smile. "Please don't call me brave, Xavier. A brave girl would have been there to defend her family. A brave woman would have at least put up a fight when surrounded by horny orcs looking to her." Xavier kept mute as she paused. "I am just a timid girl, sir. I have been through a lot, but I have also taken away a very important lesson from my experience as well. Hatred and blood have taught me that tears and anger are the most useless things on earth. Survival is the ultimate battle and I must win at it." Xavier couldn't help but bitterly remember Miss Mary, the lady who had committed suicide after being raped by the orcs. He assumed that most women would pick suicide after experiencing firsthand a sexual assault by orcs. But Adelia had proven his assumption wrong. She had picked survival over suicide. Xavier thought to himself, this world really is a terrible place for women. The duo had been walking quite a distance now. They had covered a decent 5 miles since they had begun their journey together. The intensity sun overhead had increased from the warm morning glow of sunrise, to the oppressively overbearing heat of noonday. It wasn't just the humidity, it was also the fact that both of them hadn't slept a wink all through the night. Xavier was a trained soldier who had been conditioned to withstand less than unfavorable situations. But his female companion clearly wasn't built for the stress. Adelia had spent much of the previous night running from her pursuers, so she hadn't slept a wink throughout the night. In addition to that, she had trekked a good 5 miles on top of her already fatigued mind and body. So, her countenance grew deathly pale. She managed to hide it for some time. But she soon started to lag behind. Her steps slowed down and she began to stumble. Once or twice she almost fell. That was when Xavier began to notice that Adelia was exhausted. He observed her closely and saw that she displayed all the signs of fatigue. There was no doubting the fact that Adelia had a resilient mind, but her resilience just couldn't support her frail body. Xavier rebuked himself inwardly for his insensitivity. Of course. He thought to himself, I should have known that she would be tired already. Xavier wasn't a fan of telling women what to do. So he deliberated on how best to approach the issue. The ever-perceptive Adelia read his mood and asked him what the problem was. I see you stealing glances my way, Xavier. Is there anything you would like to share? Xavier smiled at her quick thinking. He replied her, I was just thinking, we've been at it for a while now. Maybe we can rest for a bit and catch our breath. Adelia narrowed her eyes and looked at him suspiciously before she countered him, you don't look like you're tired. You look fine to me. Xavier made a move to present his case, well, I was just thinking. Adelia suddenly got where he was heading and flared. Hold on. You're not suggesting we take a break because of me, right? Xavier exclaimed defensively, hey. I didn't say that. She cut him off before he could land another excuse. Good. Because I am good to go. Now no more of this monkey business, okay? I don't need to rest. She said stubbornly and continued to march on. Xavier knew that she was a stubborn soul. But it was also evident that she was exhausted. He couldn't force her to take a break. While in deep thought, Xavier got the surprise of the week. The military system finally spoke. Like someone who had seen a ghost, Xavier stopped dead in his tracks and listened carefully to the system's utterance. Major Xavier Mace, please be advised, you have killed a total of 7 orcs and received 698 points. Also, you have received a total of 75 experience points. Xavier waited for the other shoe to drop. But it seemed like that was all the system had come to do at the time. He was used to the military system dropping in unannounced with crazy missions at the most awkward times. So when he heard it at the beginning, he held his breath in anticipation of whatever absurd mission that would be handed to him. It was indeed a surprise that the system had simply come to him to remind him of his new points. Chapter 32 Armor Motorcycle. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Adelia was surprised when Xavier suddenly stopped walking. She turned back to see why and was surprised to see that he had a faraway look in his eyes. It was a look that suggested that although Xavier was physically present, his mind was several miles away. She immediately assumed that this was simply a ploy to get her to rest. As she opened her mouth to speak, Xavier gestured at her to keep silent. Surprised, she stood still and scanned her environment hoping to see or hear what had gotten Xavier so worked up. Xavier had discerned that the system had come to him at that moment for a reason. He knew that it had something to do with their present predicament, so Xavier wasted no time in placing on order for an armored motorcycle. Military system, I authorize the purchase of an armor motorcycle. Affirmative, Major. Unlocked armor motorcycle worth 600 points has been purchased. Almost immediately, a brand new sparkling armor motorcycle appeared out of thin air right beside Xavier. The surprise was too much for Adelia. She shrieked and squealed at the sight as she marveled at how it had appeared. Adelia couldn't reconcile what she had just witnessed with what she knew about Xavier. She knew Xavier was a strange one right from the very moment they had met. But she wasn't quite sure what to make of him right now. But at the moment, her awe of Xavier was secondary. Right now, she was fascinated by what she had just seen. After seeing the sudden appearance of the black sleek armor motorcycle, Adelia had retreated to quite a good distance away in fear. From afar, not daring to come close, Adelia observed the black armor motorcycle in awesome wonder. The armor motorcycle was a magnificent sight to behold. Its tough exterior suggested that it was a machine built for circumventing rugged and tough terrains. It was built like a beast. The strong glossy black rubber wheel smelled like a freshly delivered from the factory. It had 4 exhaust pipes, 2 on each side, that suggested that it could combust fuel at 4 times the regular rate, inadvertently boosting its horsepower by a significant degree. It possessed a kind armored mechanism at the front that was guaranteed to raise down any obstacle in its path. Adelia took in the sight with genuine interest. She immediately concluded that Xavier must be a summoner who dabbled in the dark arts. It was the only logical conclusion she could think of to explain all of this. Xavier loved new gear. So, he wasted no time and hopped on his. It was a push to start, so it needed no keys. He switched it on and fired up the ignition and revved the engine so hard. Vroom. 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 It sounded like a rocket blasting off in space. Adelia covered her ears with both hands in shock. To her, it sounded like an entire horde of wild bulls and orcs mooing and grunting in harmony. Satisfied with the warm-up, Xavier gestured Adelia to come forward and hop on behind him. Adelia was scared at first, but her adventurous side prevailed and she gingerly mounted the bike as one would mount a horse. She almost slipped and fell, but Xavier helped her at the last second. He lifted her up as one would easily lift up an 8-year-old, and placed her gently on the bike. Adelia was thrilled. This was certainly not what her everyday life looked like back at home. Xavier chuckled slightly when he saw the befuddled look on her face. After he made sure that she had been positioned well on the bike, he himself mounted on prepped for the journey ahead. Miss Adelia, I suggest you hold on tight. We are going to be going really fast. Adelia laughed mockingly. Then replied him in a confident voice, Ha! I have ridden the fastest war horse Xavier, I think I can handle this. Let's go. Xavier had anticipated the fact that she might say something like that. She was a very willful woman and everything was a contention with her. He figured arguing with her was going to be pointless. So, he didn't even bother trying to convince her. He revved the engine hard and let go of the throttle with a jolt. Nothing prepared Adelia for the kickback. She very nearly would have been thrown off the motorcycle had she not managed to latch on to Xavier's armored vest at the last second. The motorcycle went from 0 to 80 km per hour in less than 3 seconds. Adelia's cries got lost in the wind that seemed to be rushing towards her on both sides. Instinctively, she embraced Xavier in a tight hug. Xavier stiffened a bit as he felt her luscious breasts pressed up on his back. The cold air had aroused her firm nipples so he could feel them poking him through her threadbare gown. Both were adults and were fully aware, this sexually charged undertone added to the thrill of going at 100 km per hour on a bike with the wind rushing through their hair. Quick as lightning, the armor motorcycle tore through the forest at supersonic speed. It zoomed through the woods like a wild horse that was out of control. The spikes at the front of the motorcycle served as a plow that practically eviscerated everything in its path. The motorcycle was unstoppable. Its tough wheels ran through the bush, thickets and thorns. The only thing the spikes in front of the armor motorcycle couldn't crush were the thick tree trunks that littered the forest like massive pillars. But those were the only obstacles in Xavier's way. He weaved around the trees, expertly dodging them and avoiding any form of collision. All around her, images rushed by her with blinding speed. The familiar horizon she had thought to be far ahead quickly rushed to meet her and the former landscape disappeared in a blitz in the distance. The fear that came with the terrifying speed was paralyzing. It wasn't like any horse she had ever ridden, not by a long shot. The strange mechanical buzz and whirring of the motorcycle was unfamiliar and yet, strangely comforting. Gradually, Adelia leaned into it, and with each passing minute, her fear subsided and her confidence increased geometrically. Within a very short while, euphoria and ecstasy, as well as a rush of adrenaline overcame her and relegated her original fears to the back of her mind. Chapter 33 Reach. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Adelia was high on the thrill of the ride. The blonde beauty was ecstatic. Like the mythical Valkyries who flew down from the heavens, Adelia's golden hair fluffed in the wind as she flew across the forest. She had never been on the end of such a fantabulous experience, so she savored every single moment. She knew that in years to come, there would be many a night where she would lay in bed and recall vividly this very moment. It was a moment when she felt the full weight of the word freedom. It was a moment when she felt unstoppable, powerful, and at the same time excited. All around her, like a deity passing through a dimension whose laws were far beneath it, enthralled by the seductive power of speed, Adelia felt she was far above the laws that governed her world. If she didn't need to hold on for her dear life, Adelia would have wanted to stretch out her arms like with wings of a bird and take in every moment she spent on the motorcycle flying. Her white gown, her beautiful, full blonde hair, and her out-of-this-world beauty made her seem like an ephemeral entity. The ride had proven to be really therapeutic for Adelia. For someone who had suffered from the overbearing influence of her past, Adelia had never had the opportunity to feel this kind of power. It was the kind of joy that came from being in a position of power, a position whereby she could do anything, a position that was further augmented by the hope that she was riding to extinguish the raging flame of the orcs who had for so long traumatized her. For the first time, the looming shadow of the orcs' abominations in her past was nothing but a mere memory. Although she didn't know it at the time, these were the issues that her subconscious was working on as she flew through the woods at a dangerous speed on a vessel she assumed had been birthed from magic. Within a significantly short period, her emotions had undergone a very impressive metamorphosis. From the initial crippling fear that had engulfed her, to a state of excitement, Adelia had transcended those states into a realm of euphoria and ecstatic bliss. It was the kind of high that psychedelics couldn't possibly give. No, the feeling was only similar to the kind of high that adrenaline junkies got from accomplishing extraordinary physical feats. She felt a rush of savagery course through her being, and the buildup found its outlet through her mouth from her vocal cords. Adelia began to scream. It wasn't a scream of helplessness or despair, it was a shout of joy. The kind that was birthed from pure happiness. Seated at the front of the motorcycle, Xavier heard Adelia shouting ecstatically behind him. Though her voice was lost in the rushing wind all around him and in the steady whirring of the motorcycle, Xavier could tell that she was joyous. He could tell by the way that tightened her embrace. As she held on to him, he could feel her heartbeat rising every second. He smiled to himself as he thought on it, I guess it's true what they say then, no girl can find it easy to resist the allure of a superfast motorcycle. However, like all things, every experience must come to an end. The journey that should have taken them over 24 hours to cover had been covered in under 2 hours. Adelia was sad when the motorcycle began to slow down as the valley before them, like the gradual budding of a rare flower, slowly came into their full view. Adelia had enjoyed every bit of it while it lasted, but she sensed the tension in Xavier's shoulders as he drew the motorcycle to a graceful halt, and knew that serious business was at hand. She was more than grateful for the experience, but that was merely the appetizer. The real joy would come from watching Xavier go to town on the orcs. Xavier had already begun taking due precautions. As they alighted from the motorcycle, Adelia observed that he had stopped 3 miles away from the orcs' valley. She knew that this was intentional. A part of her thought that he would drive in straight to their hideout and begin an all-out assault. She had fantasized about it at the beginning of their journey here, but Adelia knew that it was just wishful thinking on her own end. She had seen the way Xavier had handled the first set of orcs who had surrounded her, so she knew that Xavier was a thinking man. She resolved to watch him work this time. As she was still thinking, Xavier muttered some strange words like he was speaking to something she couldn't see. Military system, repossessed the armor motorcycle instantly. And sure enough, in the blink of an eye, Xavier withdrew the motorcycle into the system. Adelia watched aghast as the black machine she had ridden suddenly vanished. She opened her mouth to ask Xavier how he did it but quickly shut her mouth when she saw the seriousness on Xavier's face as he scouted the terrain. The valley before them was like a deep gully in the middle of the woods. The valley looked like the scene where a meteorite had crashed. The depression in the earth was surrounded by high-rise trees, vegetation and cliffs. It was behind these trees that Xavier and Adelia had chosen to hide out and strategize. The sun was high up in the sky and shone directly over the valley, so, hidden in the surrounding woods, both of them were protected from the full glare of the sun's harsh rays and at the same time, they were shielded from the sight of any orcs. From this vantage point, Xavier's watchful eyes pored over every detail in the landscape before him. He didn't miss a single thing. He took a closer look and soon found what he was looking for. At the base of the valley, in the northeast, he spotted orc activity. Sprawled in uneven formation, at the base of the valley were a tribe of orcs. They came in all shapes and sizes. But they were still repulsive nonetheless. That was the confirmation he had been waiting for. Although he knew that the dying orc couldn't possibly have lied about this location, but he was a wary man by nature, so he just couldn't take any chances. Now that he had seen tribe of orcs, Xavier watched the valley closely. He soon discovered a certain peculiar cliff close to the valley that was partly hidden in the bushes, and at the same time, extended into the valley a bit. Xavier beckoned Adelia to come, she shuffled over on her feet, and Xavier explained what he planned to do. Look over there. He pointed in the direction of the cliff and Adelia's eyes followed. Do you see that cliff? She nodded. We are going there. It's the perfect place to stay to observe the orcs. And also, it is perfect for an ambush. He didn't wait for her to ask any questions or digest the information he had just handed to her. He simply headed there as she followed closely behind him. As a race, the orcs had several tribes littered across the world. This valley was home to the particular tribe of orcs that troubled the town. Xavier estimated that there would be between 400 to 450 orcs in this particular tribe. As he headed to the cliff, Xavier began to cook up the best way to completely annihilate this tribe. He had some ideas, but he needed the perfect one. Chapter 34 How many you are listening at novelfull.audio. As the duo steadily made their way up the cliff, Adelia stuck close to Xavier like a second shadow. Not daring to make a sound, she tiptoed her way as they ascended the cliff, not daring to step outside the path that Xavier had already blazed for her. Like a child or an apprentice following a senior, she stuck close to him, literally walking in his every footsteps. With only a couple of hours to dusk, the evening sun hung in the western part of the sky, bathing the valley and the surrounding terrain in a dull brownish-orange. Adelia and Xavier were headed eastward so they didn't have to deal with the glare of the evening sun. With the sun's rays behind them, they trudged on in silence until they arrived at the top of the cliff. From the height from which they stood, Adelia and Xavier looked down and saw the orcs in the valley below. As Adelia strained her eyes because of the distance, she noticed Xavier had lifted up to his eyes 2 iron cylinders that had been bound together. At first, it puzzled her. It made no sense that Xavier would willingly choose to impair his own vision with a pair of iron cylinders. But as she watched him keenly, she silently observed that Xavier's sight was far from blocked. If anything, he seemed to be watching something closely. His tense shoulders, his regulated breathing, and his unusual fixation on the tubes all pointed towards the fact that Xavier was watching. But no matter how the blonde beauty tried to rack her brain, she found herself in the dark. Unable to contain her curiosity anymore, and with her heart beating nervously, Adelia finally confronted Xavier. Pardon me, Mr. Xavier, sir, but what is that? Xavier put down the binoculars and stared at her with a blank look. What? Adelia enlightened him by pointing towards the binoculars which was firmly locked in his strong hands. You mean this? Xavier asked to be sure. Adelia nodded affirmatively. For a minute, Xavier forgot that this was a simple country girl from a very different timeline. Of course she wouldn't know what a pair of binoculars was. Like the rest of the members of this generation, they were still very far from discovering the power of science and applied technology. Hence, a pair of high-tech binoculars might as well be an idol or a toy, or whatever the simple-minded folks would interpret it as. Xavier knew explaining wouldn't make it any better. So, he chose to show her instead. He beckoned her to come closer. Adelia eagerly stepped forward with the eagerness of one who had been asked to come forward as a volunteer for a magic show. Xavier handed it over to her and spoke slowly, making sure to enunciate each word properly. He didn't want to have to explain any more than he had to. "I use this to see clearly," he said flatly. Adelia's clueless set of eyes looking back at him showed that she clearly hadn't understood him. Xavier encouraged her to try it. "Go on, it is not just me, you can also use it, see better." It seemed the second and third part of his last statement had somehow done the trick. She gingerly mimicked his movements and lifted the binoculars and placed them in front of her eyes, hoping to see wonders. But to her surprise, she was slammed in the face with a profound disappointment. All she saw was pitch blackness. Angrily, she turned towards Xavier to complain. "It's not working for me," she snapped in annoyance. "Oh Xavier, is it because I am not a top mage or a sorcerer? Why can't I also see? I want to see." Her petulance was akin to that of a toddler. Even as she complained and wailed like an 8-year-old, she fumbled with the binoculars frantically, hoping to somehow unlock its powers of greater sight. Truly amused, Xavier watched her battle with his binoculars. The only thing keeping him from bursting out loud in laughter was his self-control and self-discipline. This beautiful blonde was proving to be a real character. Xavier's binoculars was the least sophisticated equipment among his gear, so truth be told, there wasn't much technicality involved its handling. But the unfortunate Adelia had placed them upside down, hence rendering her own sight virtually useless. Xavier entertained himself a little more as he watched her go toe-to-toe with his binoculars. Having amused himself, he finally decided to step in. "Adelia," he began calmly, "you placed them upside down." Adelia was as transparent as they come. He watched as a look of realization dawned on her. She refused to dwell on her mistake any longer than she had to. The young woman immediately applied Xavier's correction and flipped the binoculars. This time, she lifted it purposefully over her eyes, and stared in the direction of the orcs. "Wow!" Adelia exclaimed. "This is incredible. It is all so clear. I feel like I am literally standing close by." Truly the young beauty was overjoyed. Xavier could see that clearly. He observed her calmly as she shook with excitement. Never had he thought he would see anyone this happy to see a whole tribe of orcs. Still basking in the joy of her victory, Adelia turned sharply in Xavier's direction and tapped him on the shoulder. Giddy as a child, she asked Xavier happily, "Oh mister, are you an alchemist? Because you really must be one to pull off something like this." Xavier's first instinct was to counter her flawed supposition, but he ended up hesitating at the last moment. Upon further thought, Xavier discovered it was probably better that he agreed with her. It would save him from the burden of having to explain things to her. It was clear as noonday that explaining would only lead to more questions, and these questions which would definitely lead to more mysteries. Right now, it was expedient that he simply went along with her. So, in a placid tone, Xavier indulged her, "Yes, I am." Adelia's eyes glowed even brighter as Xavier confirmed her suspicions. "I knew it. Oh, I knew it." A mischievous expression stole across the blonde beauty's face, replacing her excited demeanor. Adelia lowered her gaze and reduced the volume of her voice as she asked Xavier a roguish question, "Mr. Xavier, please tell me, how many orcs do you plan on killing this time?" Somehow, Xavier wasn't entirely surprised by her question. In fact, he was a bit moved by her openness about this situation. Despite all she had been through at the hands of the orcs, she had willfully chosen to follow him on his mission to exterminate them. The hour of judgment was at hand. The hour she had been waiting her whole life was finally here. She was simply grateful to be here to watch the orcs fall under Xavier's wrath. But it didn't mean that she wasn't going to savor it. Xavier stared at Adelia. He understood part of her pain. So instead of answering her directly, he turned the question around and made it more personal. How many would you like me to kill? Chapter 35. All of them. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The severity of the question wasn't lost on Adelia. Without stopping to bother with the numbers, she answered him with a fierce look and a vengeful fire in her eyes. All of them. She answered in a quiet and cold voice that was barely above a whisper. I want to kill every single one of those miserable abominable creatures. I want their blood to flow in rivers and soak up the earth. I want them wiped off the surface of the earth. As soon as she finished speaking, Adelia shrank back with a sense of abject littleness. She knew that her desire was merely wishful thinking. She knew that it was practically impossible. She had been consumed by the bitterness of her past, and in that moment she had voiced out her deepest darkest wish. No one had ever asked her that before. No one had cared enough to ask. Benoel dem. So when Xavier asked, the floodgates burst open, and everything she had kept buried came rushing to the top with blinding speed. What would you give me if I really did kill all the orcs in this tribe? His voice pulled her out of the sea of uncertainties in which her mind had been temporarily trapped in. Her eyes met Xavier's deep dark eyes. She held his gaze steadily, trying to discern if he was joshing or not. But the more she looked at his serene face and serious expression, the more she saw that this was not a joke to him at all. Convinced that Xavier was serious and wasn't just pulling her legs, she finally answered with a seriousness that matched Xavier's own mood, Mister, if you truly kill off every single orc here, there is nothing you ask of me that I wouldn't do. Adelia wasn't a child. She knew the full weight of the promise she had just made. Xavier was touched by her resolve. But he wasn't typically the kind of person who showed their true feelings. So with a stony look, he gave her an ambiguous answer, let's see what happens next then. Back in town, the exasperated Tacy stumbled through the streets like a mad person. One look at her and one could tell that all wasn't well with the young girl. Worry lines had crept all over her young face, her eyes had sunk deep into her sockets and her normally bright countenance had somehow been dampened. Tacy wasn't sick, not physically anyway. At the moment, she was consumed with one thought only, Xavier Mace. Tacy had spent close to 24 hours searching out Xavier. If she had her way, she would have definitely flipped the entire town upside down just to get a clue that would lead her to Xavier's whereabouts. Logic dictated that she head to the last place Xavier had been last sighted, in this case, it was the hotel. But regrettably, the hotelier hadn't been of much help. She still remembered the hungry look in his eyes when she inquired after Xavier. Instead of coming outright to tell her that he didn't have a clue, he chose to veer to the left by making an advance on her. Tacy did not attempt to hide her disgust. Filled with a savage indignation, Tacy stormed right out of the hotel. Over the next few hours, she poured all her energy into scouring the town for Xavier. Have you seen a stranger dressed in black? He is tall and handsome. Tacy asked this question so much that it resonated in her subconscious even while she slept. But unfortunately for her, she was met with the same answer every single time, a resounding no. The anxiety gradually morphed into worry, and within a relatively short period, the worry morphed into full-blown fear. Evening gradually brought the end of the day. Still, Tacy searched every corner of Sakita town. As her mind ruminated on the recent events that had transpired, Tacy began to fear the worst. She knew without doubt that Xavier had probably headed off in the direction of the orcs to look for trouble. She mumbled to herself as she tried to sort out her thoughts, if that is truly the case, then I have to go to Master Caden to solicit his help. Xavier can't possibly handle this orc problem all by himself. Yes. I must go back to Master Caden. True to her word, Tacy headed straight towards the underground exchange. She hurried along on her little feet, and time passed by in a blur. The regular appealing nightlife had lost its appeal in her eyes. Men waited in the dark to rendezvous with their maidens, the singers on the streets singing ballads of heroes of old, the smell of roasted animal fat being skewed by meat vendors on the roadside. None of these appealed to Tacy any longer. Even the crescent moon seemed to have lost its radiance to Tacy. A couple of people said hi to her, but they might have as well been greeting a ghost. Tacy was physically present, but her mind was miles ahead. She navigated through the streets and finally arrived at the underground exchange. She ignored everyone else and went straight to Caden's door. Not bothering to knock on the great oak door, as was her usual habit, Tacy charged right in audaciously. Caden, who had been bent over at his table, jumped up in surprise. A cloud of anger eclipsed his normally placid eyes as he barked angrily at his subordinate, "Tacy. How many times do I have to tell you to knock before you?" Tacy wasn't in the mood for their usual back and forth. She went on to voice her concern. "There is an issue that requires immediate attention, Master Caden." Caden tensed when he heard the seriousness and urgency in her voice. He knew bad news when it stood before him, and it was currently written all over Tacy. "Xavier is missing. I have searched for him everywhere, but he is nowhere to be found. I believe he must have headed off to fight the orcs by himself." Her voice was thick with emotion. "I fear the worst might have already happened, Master Caden." She began to sob quietly. The atmosphere in the room was one of gloom. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the room and Tacy's muffled sobs were the only sounds that kept the office space from plunging into an abyss of uncomfortable silence. Caden was the type for words, but at this moment, he was lost in his own thoughts as he digested the new information brought in by his waitress and ward. It took him a while, but he finally shook off the eerie feeling that he had contacted from Tacy. He reprimanded himself inwardly. Tacy was a young woman, and as the matured mind in the room, he was supposed to keep a level head and assess the situation objectively. It would be counted as juvenile, he sighed aloud before breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Tacy." The old man began with a comforting tone, "I admit that things aren't looking too good right now, but you have allowed your worries to completely overshadow your reasoning." Tacy looked at him with burning black eyes. This wasn't what she had expected. The old man understood that she was coming from a place of emotion, so he ignored her glare. "You seem to have forgotten the type of man Xavier is. Do I need to remind you of his skill set and dexterity with weapons? Xavier is a man that takes care of business. If he willingly headed off to confront the orcs, best believe that he has a plan." A faint ray of hope shimmered in Tacy's eyes. She knew the old man was correct. Caden reclined in his chair and looked Tacy squarely in the eye. "Xavier isn't the careless type, Tacy. Trust his judgment, that's the least you can do right now. Xavier is very daring, he can do anything." Tacy remained on her feet. Gradually, she began to warm up to the comforting words of the old man. "But that doesn't mean your suspicions aren't well grounded." Her eyes flung open at his words. "So, just to be on the safe side, I will send out a few hunters with the task of finding Xavier. This should put your mind at ease for now. Don't worry, I will personally oversee this expedition myself." Tacy nodded her head vehemently in appreciation as she wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She bowed slightly and left his presence. Chapter 36. Pray you are listening at novelfull.audio. Within a short while, Caden summoned the most striking hunters in the underground keep. He briefed them on the situation, and he also let them know that they were going after a man who was consumed with taking down orcs. The hunters weren't in the least scared. In a way, they were kind of excited. They all saw the expedition as a chance to prove their bravado and gain for themselves the glory that came with engaging orcs. Plus, Caden was leading the group. The old man was well respected in these parts. He was something of a local legend himself, so the hunters considered an honor to ride along with him. Thus, armed to the teeth and equipped with all manner of weapons, the small group set out to seek out Xavier. Tacy decided that she wasn't going to wait around for good or bad news. She stubbornly went along with the band of crude hunters to search out the cold quiet man who had stolen her heart. Completely oblivious of the happenings on the other side of town, Xavier was submerged in his mission. The attractive young woman with him found it increasingly difficult to keep up with his mysterious ways. Adelia watched on as her traveling companion carried out the strangest task. From the short distance which she stood away from Xavier, she could barely make out the physical form of the strange items he was burying on the road. Adelia thought to herself, these alchemists are a weird bunch. What could this possibly turn out to be? Her curiosity soon got the better of her. Adelia called out softly to Xavier, those iron blocks look kind of heavy. Would you like some help burying them in the road? Xavier looked at her like as if she had just asked him to do something crazy like setting her ablaze. It was evident that there was definitely more than what Xavier had chosen to let on. Adelia, listen up. His tone betrayed another level of utter seriousness which Adelia hadn't seen before. Do not ever step into this mass of land I have just mapped out. No matter what. The warning was supposed to serve as a deterrent to discourage her from indulging any adventurous thoughts she was breeding, but somehow, it had achieved the opposite of the intended effect. It only further strengthened Adelia's suspicions. The young woman hadn't the slightest clue of the nature of the strange iron blocks which Xavier had carefully buried, but her sharp mind discerned that it was probably designed to ambush the enemy in some kind of entrapment. After Xavier finished up with the setup on the ground, he took out one of his favorite pieces, the assorted sniper's rifle that was fully equipped with a night vision scope. This rifle had proven to be very effective during his previous bouts with the orcs. The killer in Xavier was already forming a sentimental bond with the weapon. The cliff was the perfect spot to set up the rifle. There was ample space to maneuver and it offered a clear line of sight to his prey. After completing everything that needed to be done, Xavier and Adelia lay down at the edge of the cliff in crouched positions. Anxious about the slaughter that was to come, like crocodiles waiting to snatch up babies at a watering hole, Xavier and Adelia remained still as they waited for night to fall. As dusk slowly faded into night, Xavier suddenly got an unexpected surprise from the military system. Major Xavier, do you require some ration? Xavier was taken aback. He wasn't quite sure how to take this sudden display of concern by the military system. Up until this moment, Xavier had nothing to worry about with regards to the system. But right now, Xavier was shocked by the humane way with which the system had approached him. Xavier decided to take advantage of the sudden change of pace. If the military system was offering him food ration, then who was he to turn down such a golden opportunity? He thought for a second before replying it accordingly, I wish to redeem 1 point for a pack of compressed cookies. The reply was prompt as usual. Xavier could have sworn that he detected a faint note of eagerness in the military system's voice. Though he wasn't completely sure, but it almost sounded like the military system was actually happy to serve him this time. 1 pack of compressed cookies coming right up. The package emerged and in a generous quantity. Encased in a thin white foil and locked in a takeout pack, Xavier received the full measure of his request. It wasn't that he was hungry, no. Xavier had undergone intense training in his past, so basically it's virtually impossible for him to allow a trifling craving like hunger to keep him away from succeeding at his mission. The real beneficiary from Xavier's request was Adelia. The young girl had been through so much in the past couple of days. Exhausted, hungry and sleep-deprived, it was a true miracle that she had survived this long. Xavier retrieved the pack and handed it over to Adelia, whose eyes were fastened upon the valley before her. Here, have some of this. You need to replenish your strength. Completely unfamiliar with the fancy packaging of the snack, the bewildered Adelia eyed it suspiciously. Xavier encouraged her, go on then. It's yours. He tossed it into her hands. Even as she clasped the fancy snack in her hands, Adelia wasn't exactly sure what to do with it. Its entire outlook seemed too sophisticated for an ordinary snack. She looked at the compressed cookies in her hands, and looked back at Xavier with unknowing eyes. She had no idea what to do with it. Xavier soon realized that the young girl probably hadn't seen a something of this nature before. This was clearly centuries ahead of culinary packaging. Xavier was truly amused. No wonder she had seemed so lost. He took it back from her and casually unsealed the takeout package, releasing the aromatic, sensational smell of the cookies. Adelia gasped aloud right before her throat made a gulping sound. Mr. Xavier! What manner of sorcery is this? How did you summon a sweet-flavored meal of this nature? Her eyes were wide and shock and surprise was plastered all over her face. Xavier chuckled slightly before patiently replying her, "It's not sorcery, Adelia." But the oblivious girl began to protest as she pointed her finger at the unveiled delicacy. But nothing. Xavier silenced her. Now eat up, we have a long night ahead of us. You need every energy you can muster right now. Xavier had managed to shut her up, but no amount of brainwashing could make Adelia believe that this was nothing other than magic. In her sight, Xavier was truly an extraordinary mage. She gingerly took a piece out of the silver foil and took the first bite. Xavier felt like he was watching a movie. Adelia's performance was worthy of an Oscar. As the first bite entered her mouth and melted in her tongue, he could literally see the burst of flavor spreading waves of joy across the young woman's face. Her countenance brightened immediately, as her eyes regained a tiny fraction of its original light. She beamed with smile as she stared at the unbelievably sweet snack. Heavens! What is this? She looked at Xavier with delight. He didn't bother to answer her, he simply sat back and enjoyed the look on her face as she digested the exotic snack. Adelia continued her praises. This must be what kings feast on. Oh Xavier, what is this snack made of? I have never tasted anything so incredibly delicious in my life. Adelia seemed to conjure more praise by the second. She thought she could eat a whole sea of cookies, but after gobbling up a few, she discovered that they were not just empty snacks. To what appeared to her as sorcery, she found out that she didn't need to ingest too much before she got full. With a handful of cookies and a protruding belly, she expressed her concern to Xavier, "What is this? I have barely eaten and yet, I feel full already. Oh Xavier, you have to tell me what this is. Please." Once again, Adelia did not wait for Xavier to reply her, she immediately went back to forcing herself to ingest the delicacy despite the fact that she was full. If she had been paying more attention, she would have noticed that Xavier's attention had shifted from her to the valley below. Chapter 37 Attack. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Dusk quickly melted away and made way for the serene blackness of the night. There was no moon that night. Heavy storm clouds completely eclipsed the moon, covering the heavens with the overbearing nature of a heavy blanket, blocking out any form of silvery light from trickling down to the earth. Xavier was more than grateful for the encompassing darkness. Xavier didn't think of himself as a superstitious guy, but even he couldn't deny the fact that nature somehow seemed to be in alignment with his interest tonight. It was almost impossible not to see the correlation between his mood and the mood that pervaded the atmosphere. As he lay still on the cliff, with his eye firmly pressed on this scope, Xavier watched the orcs' movements and noted their mannerisms and moods. Clearly, they were unaware of the looming danger that was hovering over them like a natural disaster. How could they know? Xavier watched the unmannered and uncivilized creatures. Unencumbered by the overbearing blackness that had enveloped the valley like gloomy dark robes, Xavier was able to see through with the help of his high-tech night vision infrared display on the scope of his sniper rifle. This particular feature was one of the few things that made the sniper so dangerous. It had been calibrated into his rifle such that he could even see the heat signature of an enemy hiding behind a rock. Xavier watched keenly as the clueless orcs emerged from their caves and went about their routine of preparing for the night's hunt. Clearly, the ugly muscled creatures were still operating under the false assumption that the night belonged to them. They had remained unchallenged for so long now that they saw no need to mount up sentries or guard posts. This was the height of their confidence. The moment Xavier had been waiting finally came. He observed closely and noticed that all the orcs had gathered together in one place. They seemed to have assembled together under their leader in anticipation of the night's hunt. Unfortunately for the orcs, they had managed to provide the best possible scene for a sniper. They were all sitting ducks, waiting to be wasted by the sniper's bullets. The night was dark, but it was going to be set aflame by Xavier's wrath. Xavier squeezed and the first bullet tore through the air at a blinding speed. There was no wind, so the bullet stayed on its trajectory path. In the blink of an eye, the unfortunate orc whose ill luck had brought him on the 5mm, 3-inch bullet, slumped to the ground with a look of absolute shock. Xavier checked to see if there was any reaction. There was none. Xavier's strike wasn't random in any way. Because the orcs were gathered together in a kind of assembly, he had chosen to begin with a very basic taking down the orcs who were behind. As each bullet ruptured the skulls of the unsuspecting orcs, they dropped to their death with a look of surprise that permanently remained plastered on their faces even as corpses. The bodies had started to pile up in a neat file. The fact that they were under attack completely eluded the orcs. Xavier would have continued his killing spree uninterrupted if not for the leader who soon realized that they were under attack. The leader of this tribe was significantly taller and bigger than the rest of the other regular orcs. So, even though he was at the forefront of the gathering, his height had given him an advantage. From where he stood, he saw a pile of dead bodies arranged in an almost orderly order, starting from the back. Immediately, he let out a terrible wail that prompted instant reactions in the cluster or orcs. It was a terrible shrill voice that sounded like a battle cry, an alarm, and a death dirge. In a series of terrible grunts and cries, the leader ordered that everyone hide. The pandemonium that followed was epic. From the height he was, Xavier could help but derive a perverse joy as he watched them scramble about to safety. It wasn't like there was anywhere that was safe from Xavier's savage indignation. The orcs hadn't realized it yet, but they would soon realize just how much destruction awaited them at the hands of the assassin hidden in the cliff above the valley. The signal that came from the leader hinted at the fact that they were under attack. And yet, as the orcs stampeded about aimlessly, they discovered to their absolute horror that could neither see nor hear the enemies. This further confused, enraged, and terrified the simple-minded bland creatures. As Xavier watched them scramble about in the valley beneath him, he knew that he had lost his advantage as a sniper. If he continued to take them out in this fashion, it wouldn't take long before they discerned that they were under attack from a single source. Orcs were the original gang members. The herd mentality they were stuck with made them believe that numbers was everything. No doubt, they would be emboldened if they were ever to discover that their enemy was one. And a band of emboldened orcs was bad news. Xavier's mind quickly adjusted to the new situation and immediately deduced the problem. This particular tribe of orcs still had their leader, and because of that, they would make sound judgments. If they were to see their leader drop dead like an ordinary piece of meat, their reactions would be the exact opposite. But Xavier was far from worried. Being the astute soldier, he had already devised clever contingencies to counter these irregularities. Xavier casually took out his RPG from where it had been stashed. The vast expanse of land was perfect for this rocket launcher. In those precious moments, Adelia never took her eyes off Xavier. She watched him prep his gear with a chilling calmness. There wasn't a trace of urgency in his movements. Through the peephole, Xavier honed in on the direction of the cowering orcs. The souls of the orcs were waiting to be drawn. Retribution was lurking around the corner like a serpent lying in wait for the rodent. The orcs thought the worst was already over, but unknown to them, they were about to be hit with a destruction so terrible and so incomprehensible, they wouldn't be able to stand it. Adelia did not think that there was anything or anyone on Earth who could make the orcs cower in fright. Xavier finally squeezed the trigger and death descended on the orcs with silent inevitability. Adelia gasped as the rocket flew out of the launcher towards the valley. Her eyes followed the trajectory of the rocket as it blazed through the sky like a shooting star. Unlike the cold stealth of the bullet from Xavier's sniper rifle, the rocket blazed forth brazenly with a terrifying swoosh accompanying it. Its incandescent glow raged audaciously. The poor orcs who were in hiding were taken unawares. Boom! The resounding boom of the explosion resonated through the entire valley, sending shock waves rippling through the nearby surrounding. About a dozen orcs who had been hiding in a makeshift bunker was decimated to a million irreparable fragments by the wicked rocket. Bits and pieces of roasted flesh and bones flew about. In that moment it was almost as if it was raining meat. The explosion had triggered a kind of mini-earthquake, adding to the list of things the orcs had to worry about. Xavier watched with satisfaction as the fruit of his plans brought forth more fruits. The attack was purely destructive, and it came with an audacity that was both overwhelming and daring. The terrifying ball of raging orange flame illuminated the dark valley below. But the brief illumination was the only good thing that came with the explosion. The deafening explosion and the accompanying blast triggered a destructive wave that quickly spiraled into an apocalypse-like catastrophe. If the clueless orcs had underplayed the seriousness of the attack before, they were definitely awake now. To them, it seemed like the end of the world. Those who hadn't been killed due to proximity remained frozen in shock. Those who attempted to run were devoured whole by the insatiable hunger of the devouring fire that had been birthed from the explosion. It was a cacophony of screams, explosions, destruction and earthquakes. Terror was the order of the day. There wasn't a single orc in the valley who had been unscathed. Either they were dead, seriously injured, burned, crushed or simply terrified. Chapter 38 Gatling. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Adelia didn't know what to expect at first, but when the destruction played out before her eyes, the simple-minded girl recoiled in fright. There was no degree of preparation that could have possibly prepared her for the devastation she had just witnessed. With her mouth hung open, she watched in shock as Xavier wrought his destruction on the thoughtless creatures in the valley below. When she did finally manage to tear her eyes away from the horrifying scene beneath her, she swallowed hard as she looked at Xavier. She hadn't expected him to be so powerful. Adelia had a newfound respect for the stranger who hadn't only saved her life, but had single-handedly taken on an entire tribe of orcs in the most unconventional way. Who is this man? How is it that he possesses this much power? Adelia thought to herself. Either Xavier missed her worshipful stare on purpose, or he simply didn't know her eyes were fixated on him. Xavier had gone into battle mode, and his full attention was on his prey beneath him. Despite the encompassing chaos all around, the leader of the orcs had somehow managed to determine the location from which the attack had come. As the other orcs scampered about like lost puppies, the leader rose to his full height and cocked his ugly head towards the very cliff on which Xavier had camped. His full glare rested on the very spot where Xavier and Adelia were. Although he couldn't see anything, he was sure that his attackers were stationed there. Xavier didn't know whether to be impressed or not. This was some next-level thinking demonstrated by the leader. This was a clear pointer to the fact that he definitely hadn't become the leader of this tribe because of his size. He appeared to have the enviable character trait of discernment. But determining the source of the attack was one thing, acting on this knowledge to produce results was a different thing entirely. As leader glared at his unknown attacker, the cries of his fellow orcs rose above the carnage, saturating the air with the bitterness of defeat. The chief orc realized on the spot that playing defense would only equal in more casualties. Besides, he wasn't ashamed to admit that he and his kind completely sucked at long-range attacks. Their strength was in their numbers. The leader of the orcs scanned the immediate terrain but he couldn't see any signs of a terrifying army, so this gave him some hope that he could use numbers to squash the unknown enemy. He lifted up the weathered and beat-down buffalo horn that was hanging by his loincloth and blew it as hard as he could. It wasn't just for show, it was a summoning tool that was instrumental in the rounding up of orcs to battle. As soon as every orc in the valley heard the summon for battle, the fear that had gripped their minds and paralyzed their bodies seemed to disappear completely. Those who were in hiding stepped out confidently and headed towards the location of their leader. The change in the mood in the valley below was as dramatic, and it had been instantaneous. The orcs had complete faith in their leader. So when the signal for the attack came, they responded like a bunch of automatons or zombies who aimlessly followed orders blindly. They descended in large numbers upon the steep hillside of the cliff. In the blink of an eye, their strong unwavering belief in their leader replaced their fear. In the place where terror had been only a few minutes ago, a quiet confidence began to take root and, slowly began to spread its branches in them like a network, until every single one of the orcs were connected to the shadowy quiet confidence of their overwhelming numbers. The closer they got to the cliff, the more their confidence swelled. They were well aware of their vast numbers. And just like their leader, they noticed that there was no trace of any overbearing army. This only augmented their confidence in themselves. Presumptuously, they began to think in their hearts, maybe the enemies aren't that strong, maybe the mages responsible for this attack had run out of strength, thus leaving themselves vulnerable to counterattacks. These were the audacious thoughts coursing through their minds. Adelia began to panic as she saw that the tide of the battle had changed completely. The poor beauty didn't want to die. She looked at Xavier frantically, but his face was as immovable as a rock. Even as the band of orcs poured down the hill in the direction of Xavier and Adelia, the young man remained stiff as a corpse. When Xavier finally decided to make his move, Adelia finally understood why he had been so calm about their encroaching numbers. It turned out that this was all part of Xavier's plan. He had anticipated that the orcs would hone in on his location and try to ambush him like a swarm of bees. In fact, he had been counting on this very gambit in order for his next stage of his plans to be fulfilled. Xavier pulled out his next weapon of destruction, his Gatling. For many reasons, Xavier had chosen this particular weapon for this next stage. Conventional weapons like the sniper rifle and the RPG were only effective under the right conditions and in specific situations. Right now, he had already exhausted those options, so it was time for him to play big. This time, the Gatling was the most appropriate weapon given the orcs' renewed vitality and newfound resolve. With this Gatling, Xavier would not only launch a destructive attack, he would end up leveling the playing field in terms of reducing the humongous numbers of these creatures. With every minute that passed, Xavier became more and more convinced that he had chosen the right weapon. Only the Gatling could provide the amount of destructive power he currently needed to wipe out a whole ton of vengeful orcs. Stumbling through the dark, unaware of the fact that they were heading towards their death with confidence, the orcs trudged on expectantly. As soon as they came into the full range of the Gatling unleashed an obscene torrent of shots that ravaged through the hillsides, completely obliterating everything in its sight. The poor orcs were no match for the rage of the Gatling. Once again, the unfortunate creatures found themselves in a very precarious position. The first batch of the orcs closest to the forefront were wasted by the rippling bullets. The automatic machine gun roared through the black night like an avenging angel of death. The orcs were well within its full range, so they were more than fair game for the weapon of destruction. This second wave of destruction wrought more death and casualties than both of Xavier's initial attacks. The situation was akin to that of a shepherd lining up his sheep in close quarters, and letting loose a submachine gun in the small confinement. The deathly cries of the orcs were swallowed by the shrill mechanic thumping of the Gatling as it tore through the orcs' ranks, completely rupturing the flesh, bones and organs of the cocky orcs. The not-so-confident creatures didn't have the opportunity to scream or run. The only thing was seen and heard was the steady roaring of the Gatling and the flashes of golden light from the rapid discharge of the weapon. It was a massacre of the bloodiest kind. The Gatling rang through the air, dropping dismembered bodies in its wake. Corpses piled on as more and more orcs dropped by the second under the assault of rapid shots. Under 2 minutes, the Gatling had managed to devour half of the orcs who had answered the call to battle. The leader of the orcs was petrified. Like a sick joke, like a nightmare, the invisible enemy had somehow managed to obliterate half of his entire forces within a very short while. A wave of terror washed over him again as he began to come to the terms with the fact that there was no way he and his fellow orcs could stand this assault. With every passing second, the evidence of this truth established itself in stone right before his eyes. Walking, breathing, live cakes. That was just how he saw he and his horde before the might of the mysterious enemy's strange magic. Chapter 39 Hunters. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Outright terror and disappointment overcame the leader as he gradually began to accept the crushing reality of the fate that awaited him. Extermination. The primal instinct of self-preservation kicked in immediately. Flight was the only option. The leader wasn't ashamed of his cowardly thoughts. Death dwarfed cowardice by far. Right now, he was desperate not to become one of the disfigured corpses surrounding him that had been struck down with the incredibly insane magic. Meanwhile, Caden's group combed through the forest with the intent of finding Xavier. But much to everyone's surprise, except the old man, they found a trail of dead orcs in the woods. The hunters with Caden were experienced hunters who had been in the game for a long time. As men of action and violence, they recognized the cruelty and psychotic nature in the way the orcs had been killed. They marveled greatly as they investigated the environment. They all searched for the obvious signs of struggle, but found none. By all counts, the orcs seemed to have been running away from their assailant. This only baffled the hunters. One of them yelled out to the others as the group investigated the dead orcs. Do y'all see this? This can't be true, right? Roger that. What the hell happened here? Is this for real? Were these orcs truly running? Bah! What beast could make a group of orcs flee? Indeed. It is unheard of. Heavens! I see no other beastly set of footprints here. A roguish fat man who closely resembled a bloated pig spat a brash reply, sorcery, this must be sorcery. Nothing can make a band of full-grown orcs run for their lives in this manner. The man's suspicions were way off from the real truth, but his supposition on what had happened wasn't entirely baseless. It was unheard of for an orc to run. One orc might be a coincidence, but the multiple dead bodies which they had chanced upon told a different story. It was unbelievable, especially for them who as hunters had witnessed the unrelenting savagery of orcs in the face of battle. So, the only logical conclusion they could arrive at was sorcery. While the others rambled and debated amongst themselves regarding the truth of what had just happened here, only Caden kept to himself. Only he knew the truth. This wasn't the work of a beast, neither was it the work of a sorcerer supreme. No, this was the handwork of the young man with the coldest set of eyes called Xavier. But he didn't voice out his own version of the truth. It was better they stayed in a mood of uncertainty. That way, they needn't worry about running into live orcs. As the group of hunters trudged through the woods in search of Xavier, for the first time in a while, Tacy found herself asking questions she never thought she would ask. Master Caden, why hasn't the nearby government sent any troops to round up the orcs causing trouble here? Tacy didn't know it, but subconsciously, the part of Xavier that clamored for change had rubbed off on her. After spending only a short while with him, Tacy had contacted Xavier's radical approach to life, and his unwillingness to conform to mediocrity. Even now, she was asking questions the same way Xavier had asked her about the basic problems plaguing the society. Caden didn't answer her immediately. Being an old man with a mature mind, he pondered on the motive and thoughts which had provoked Tacy's question. After what seemed like a while, he answered his ward wisely, "It is not that simple, Tacy, you more than anyone knows just how political these border issues can be." The old man paused, as was his usual style when lecturing younger ones, and then continued, besides, the leader of this particular tribe of the nearby orcs is extremely powerful. He is so much of a savage that he single-handedly slaughtered other orc tribes. Even members of his own race are terrified of him, much less the human government. Tacy's eyes remained fixated on the old man as she absorbed the information. There isn't a government body that is willing to sacrifice their troops and resources for such a risky endeavor, especially when the chances of success are pretty low. As the old man enlightened his young ward on the subject of the matters of the state, he himself reserved his own deep thoughts to himself. His conversation with Tracy was merely a distraction. This gambit wasn't by any means a form of denial, but on a different level, it was. The fact that Caden couldn't bring himself to admit it, didn't change the fact that he was indeed worried. He masked this encroaching fear with a false front of fuzzy warmth and the comforting aura of a wise man. Caden's fear wasn't a fear that was based on an abstract construct or an intangible variable, his fear was logical. It was based on proven facts and hard truths. This time, the truth was even scarier than the watered-down version that was being peddled amongst the group of hunters. No matter how much Caden tried to suppress it, he couldn't shake off the nagging worry that was threatening to crush him. It rose from the depth of his subconscious like the early morning mist over the deep, and slowly, it began to take a definite form, and then finally, like the epilogue of a bad story, it hung over him like an invisible shadow. Caden's worry was brought about by no other variable than the leader of this particular tribe of orcs. "Oh, Xavier," he thought to himself, "I acknowledge your extraordinary abilities, I admire your resolve to kill the oppressive orcs and defend the weak. I know that you can probably take on up to 10 orcs at a time." The old man cringed as he delved deeper into his worries. "But if it is indeed true that you have gone against an entire tribe, especially that terrible leader, then only divine intervention can save you. Because no one can." Caden dared not finish his own train of thoughts. He wasn't a mental weakling, but the thought of a skillful promising young man like Xavier going against the terrible bloodthirsty orc leader was enough to make the old magician cringe. A wave of mental fatigue began to sweep through the entire group as they trudged through the forest in their search for Caden's prodigy. The initial bravado with which the group of seasoned hunters had used to set out had grown cold, and like the remains of a once great flame, their energy had smoldered down into a cold heap of ashes. In place of that initial brimming confidence now stood doubt, fear, and the illogical immature need to suddenly turn back home. Doubt had stepped in like a palpable entity, hogging the group, feasting on their individual and collective fears, and then, after having its fill of their anxiety, like a dragon, it vomited it back on them with 10 times the ferocity, covering them with an entire blanket of terror. The canopy of trees overhead now seemed like a den harboring a band of orcs waiting to jump down on them at the last minute. Even the howling of the trees was reminiscent of the wailing of dying humans at the hands of the viciousness of the savage orcs. The decimated corpses of the orcs which they had seen a while ago now flooded their minds. Like a dissident seed, it had taken root in their minds and was now bearing the poisoned fruits of unfounded dread that was actively clouding their judgments and poisoning their thinking faculties. Within a very short period, this fear had infiltrated the group and brought on an inescapable cloud of terror. It wasn't long before an inaudible murmur began in the background. It quickly made its way through the group until it seemed like just about everyone was singing the same song. "What are we even doing?" someone asked nervously. "Yeah," a couple anonymous correspondent echoed his thoughts aloud by chorusing in unison. "This is a suicide mission." They were getting bolder by the minute. "We all saw the dead bodies of the dismembered orcs a while ago, we don't know who did that." The tall slender man speaking paused for dramatic effect before continuing. "But one thing we can say for sure is that the orcs will be out for whoever did that to their kind." Grunts of approval echoed through the group. Mutiny was in the air. The tall slender man was obviously a great orator. By the looks of it, he wasn't just another crude hunter, he had apparently mastered the art of crowd psychology. The hunters had stopped advancing now. The man championing this distraction made his way through the group, going back and forth with fire in his eyes and a penetrating gaze that seemed to burn his ideals into the hearts of every man there. Look! He shot his forefinger in the direction before them. We are almost at the habitat of the orcs, and yet we can't seem to find any trace of the person whom we are supposed to be tracking. Chapter 40 Unforeseen. You are listening at novelfull.audio. He cried with a passionate on his face. At what point do we accept that this is a pointless mission? A couple of hunters cheered him on in the background. In a deferential tone, he lowered his voice and addressed the old man who stood a little farther ahead from the group. I respect you, Master Caden. Then he sharply turned his head towards the others and spoke in a confident tone, but it expedient that we turn back now. At this point, based on what we have all seen and known, it would be unwise to proceed any further knowing what lies ahead of us. I refuse to risk this company. His last statement was the final nail in the coffin. The whole group cheered him on in agreement. There was no going forward now. Everyone's heart was set on abandoning this mission, no matter the promised reward. Caden watched the drama unfold with a look of indifference on his face. As a man who had lived a full life, he had witnessed situations such as this many times over. This wasn't his first rodeo. And because of his experience, he proffered a solution that he had personally worked for him in the past. Gentlemen. He began in a suave tone and conveyed no hard feelings or disappointment. I understand your concern. It is genuine and founded on good intentions. But you must not forget that this is the profession we have chosen for ourselves. No matter the situation, no matter the season, day and night we remain hunters. The crafty old man had begun by appealing to their sense of pride as professionals. But that wasn't his ace in the hole. Ego stroking and flattery was only the first layer. The second stage was to play on their ever-present greed. Money was always the best incentive for groups that contained men of this caliber. So, Caden pressed on in this regard. He didn't bother to soft pedal it. The old man went all out with his offer. So, I hereby offer a cash reward of 1 gold coin to anyone who aids in the discovery of Xavier. He allowed the offer marinate in their hearts. The ever-present green goblin of greed rose out of the dark chambers of their hearts and feasted on the prospects of Caden's promise of gold. Before they could recover and see through his scheme, Caden dealt out one more surprise. And 5 gold pieces goes to whosoever finds Xavier himself. The younger hunters in the group swallowed greedily. Most of them had never had up to 3% of the prize money which Caden seemed to be generously offering. No doubt, they were tempted, but the more mature hunters in the group immediately rebuffed Caden. One of the more seasoned hunters stepped forward to answer the old man. What good is gold to a corpse who has been mangled by a vengeful orc? Master Caden of the Underground Keep, our answer is no. Tacy was not pleased with the situation, not in the least bit. Shaking with rage, she wished she was a man so she could teach a lesson to the cowards who stood before. The one thing that annoyed her the most was the ostentatiousness of the whole scene. They were all obviously scared. And yet they could not own up to this simple fact. Tacy was disgusted, and it irked her that she couldn't let them know just how disgusted she was by their attitude. The young waitress/receptionist considered the cowardly hunters a disgrace to their profession. They were men whom she had served in the underground exchange. She had listened to their tales of glory, she had seen the bounties they had hauled in, and now, just when she had decided to go into battle with them, they had surprised her by proving that they were made up of the same stock as weak, fickle-minded hormonal teenagers. But despite her rage, Tacy knew that she couldn't take the moral high ground to confront these death-averse people. There and then, Tacy made a promise to herself: no matter what happens, I will not stop until I find Xavier. Nothing can stop me. Not orcs, not Master Caden, and definitely not this band of uncircumcised baboons. Outmaneuvered and outgunned, old man Caden sighed under his breath. Unlike Tacy, he understood more than anyone else why the hunters were so afraid to go forward with the mission. Their reasons weren't justified, but they were founded on reason, and the old man couldn't fault them for that. Xavier's contribution to the town was worthy of praise. He had single-handedly taken care of the goblin nuisance by annihilating them completely. So, he tried to find a middle ground in the negotiation. Very well then. You are all free men, you have made your choice. They nodded in agreement to his truthful words. But here's a counter-offer, since you all have decided not to move forward with this task, I ask that you remain here in the meantime as I and my ward move on with the task. The relief that came upon the group, along with the speed which had accompanied the way they had rushed to accept Caden's offer, confirmed Tacy's suspicions. They were terrified of what lay ahead. She began to worry for Xavier. For the first time, she started to consider what it was that had made these men to quake in their boots. Caden wasn't afraid of death. He had had several close calls in the past when he came dangerously close to the end, but that wasn't the real reason behind his seemingly absent fear of death. He was a masterful magician who could defend himself in any given circumstance. As he turned his back to leave, Caden beckoned to his young ward saying, "Come on Tacy, let's find Xavier as soon as we can." As the young girl hurried to Caden's side, she pondered for a minute on something she had picked in Caden's voice as he spoke about finding Xavier. It was a certain sense of urgency in his tone that sparked something in her, not wanting to dwell on any more negative thoughts, especially where Xavier was concerned. Tacy instantly pushed it to the back of her mind and focused on the task at hand. In the sea of uncertainty and fear, Tacy was the only one in the enviable state of courageousness. Meanwhile, the battle raged on the other side. Right from the start it hadn't been a battle, it had begun as an ambush and it had taken on the form of a slaughter. The leader of the orcs had suffered a terrible defeat at the hands of the invisible enemy. Retreat was the next best thing. As he remained hidden from the blazing attack behind a cleft of rock, the tall leader unhooked the buffalo horn from his worn-out loincloth and blew it hard 3 times. This particular signal was one signal that the leader of the orcs had never given in his lifetime. It was the signal to retreat. To withdraw shamefully and cower from the invading enemies. As he watched his fellow orcs turn to flee at his command, the leader was filled with a violent indignation. Righteous anger boiled through him, it was so intense that he physically began to tremble. Most unique leaders who have successfully ruled over time and gained for themselves the respect of others, or in this case, fear from others, almost always have that one hidden trump card. In the case of this orc leader, it was a terrifying ability that almost always guaranteed his victory. But it wasn't something he activated anyhow. This unique ability was so tasking on him that whenever he activated it, it always consumed a fraction of his psychic essence. The orc leader knew that he was left with no other option. If there was anything such as the perfect time for him to use it, it was now. As if in response to the evil that was about to be unleashed, the ominous dark clouds that had robbed the valley of the radiant silvery glow of the moon's light suddenly began to disperse. Like a fresh breath of new air, the moon's pale light slowly emerged, illuminating the orcs' base camp in the valley below. Xavier tensed when he saw that the opposition had tactfully retreated. As a member of the Special Forces unit and as an experienced soldier, Xavier knew that this was not a good sign. It wasn't good because this was a signal that the enemy had somehow managed to make a well-informed decision despite being overwhelmed on all sides. This kind of critical thinking wasn't favorable to Xavier's plans at the moment. Damn it! Xavier cursed as he observed the tactical retreat of the orcs. This isn't good at all.